Welcome to the Clima podcast. In this episode, John and I chat to the Building and Construction Minister, Penk. We discuss granny flats, possible rollbacks of the H1 changes, changes to regulations for imported building products, energy modelling, builder training, and his goal to build faster, cheaper, and simpler. Clima inspires and educates people to create healthy, durable, and energy-efficient buildings to live, learn, work, and play in. Well, good morning, Minister Penk. Can I call you Chris?
Please do. The standard line there is I get called a lot worse, so we'll go with Chris.
Fantastic. And welcome, John.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So I thought to start off, Chris, if you can give us a little bit of an idea about life growing up in West Auckland and one of five boys.
Yeah, we're very lucky to have a pretty stable, secure, ordinary, really, upbringing. One of five boys, as you say, out in West Auckland, and went to the local schools, played cricket and soccer and other things. So pretty ordinary background, to be honest, nothing particularly interesting or special. I suppose in a political environment, you've got to come up with a more interesting backstory, as they call it, but actually that's the truth of the matter.
Fantastic. And what was the house like that you grew up in? Was it cold in winter, hot in summer? What was it?
You know, it was probably quite cold. And actually the place that my wife and I and our two kids and dog are in now is quite old. It's quite drafty. So I definitely believe and understand on a personal level that we can and must do a lot better. So I've just immediately segued. I've been a classic politician and not answered the question, but actually in terms of a 90-year-old house that we're in currently, very well aware of the difference in standards and how we can and already do, obviously in a lot of ways, do things much better than a century ago, literally. But obviously we can do better too.
Awesome. And after school you went to the Navy, I believe, and then studied law?
Yeah, a few things along the way, but the long and short of it is went to university, sat behind a desk and read some Shakespeare plays for a few years, got fed up with that, ran away to sea. I'd started a law degree earlier, went back to that at various different points, but having spent a bit of time in the Navy, both here and then Australia, satisfied my desire for adventure in the way of a young man wanting to see the world and other corny things like that. So that was an enjoyable time in my life, but I'm also pleased not to be out at sea and into a different challenging environment, I suppose, of the political stormy waters instead.
Oh, fantastic. What inspired you to get into politics?
Well, I like the idea of problem solving at a policy level. And I suppose to contrast that with practicing law, where you have the ability to help people at an individual level, one client at a time, interpreting the law. Obviously, you do what you can for them, but you can, I think, achieve greater change in a way that's positive. Of course, you hope it's positive, and the whole political debate is determining whose ideas are going to do better for New Zealand, and that's obviously a healthy and interesting and enjoyable part of the process as well. But in terms of being able to solve policy problems at a high level, that struck me as quite an attractive prospect.
Awesome. Now, what would you say would you be hoping to achieve during this tenure?
I mean, in the current term of Parliament, for me, the context is I've been in opposition and my party's been in opposition for the last two terms. I've only ever known that until 6 months ago or so. And so I think we've got the ability to make some change that will be positive, but also to continue on some good work that's been done, including in the building construction space, particularly led by the private sector. I think there's a lot of enlightened individuals. And I think sitting here, I'm clearly sharing a podcast with a couple of them right now, and I know a lot of your listeners will be really proactive in that space. So what I'm hoping to achieve, certainly in the building and construction ministerial portfolio that I'm privileged to have now, is to understand what that work is that's going on and how we can support that, how we can incentivize and encourage more of the good things that are already taking place.
In your interview with Jack Tame, you mentioned that your goal is to build simply, cheaply, and quickly. So how do we do that without avoiding building a whole lot of poor quality housing that's going to affect the future of our country?
Well, that's a very good question. I think at some level we do risk a trade-off where affordability versus quality becomes, I would say, a false choice. Potentially. I mean, maybe there is an element of trade-off, in which case the good people of New Zealand collectively will decide whether they agree with those policy prescriptions or not, but also at an individual level. I mean, if we believe in a market and consumer choice, albeit with some caveats around informed choice and knowledgeable versus vulnerable consumers, nevertheless, we can say that if people are wanting to make a trade-off that represents their best interests, for example, we might end up in a discussion about what might save power bills over the 30-year period. But if the measures we need to take now are required to get to that place, make it unaffordable for a person or a family to purchase a house in the first place, then it's relatively cold comfort, if you'll excuse the pun, what their financial situation might be at the end of that 30-year period. But of course, if we think about these things potentially as a false choice and say, actually, if we enable better productivity and encourage better productivity, and it might be around materials, it might be around processes, then maybe we can do things more quickly, simply and affordably without sacrificing the quality, and maybe even, here we go, politician wanting to have his cake and eat it too, maybe get better results at the same time.
And I think that's really where that question is so key for us. We're in a building which is well insulated right here. We're in an environment where we are educating into that space of much higher building standards, or really it's not even the standard, it's the outcome. It's a performance outcome for people. So I'm really interested in digging in a little bit deeper on that. Can you maybe just unpick what simply means? So simply, what's the three? Simple, simpler?
Simply, quickly, and cheaply.
Can we unpack those? So simply, what does that look like from your standpoint at the moment?
I think simplicity from a process point of view means enabling the maximum degree of assurance that there will be high standards maintained, but without imposing complexity in terms of how we get there. So I do recognise, even as I say that there's a tension between simplicity on the one hand and certainty versus the flexibility. So, I mean, in terms of the great work that you guys are doing and that others have been engaged in the space as well, for me, the primary tension, which I haven't yet fully resolved in my own mind, by the way, really happy to think aloud here a little bit, dangerously, he said.
Please do.
Yeah, is sort of around, for example, schedule versus modelling and calculation methods in terms of how we ensure that we have homes that are sustainable, both environmentally and in the energy efficiency and the operational carbon that's consumed over 30, 50, 100 years versus a more prescriptive method. And I mean, the prescription goes to simplicity, which is great, but then when you have what I've been hearing, anecdotally at least, the unintended consequences of doing things in a way that doesn't reflect the climatic conditions of Northland versus Southland, for example, then we need to think about that a bit more, I think.
That reference there's a bunch of references within that answer. So the H1, and maybe it's worth, if you understand it well, we do this is the realm we work in. I'm not putting you on the spot, but do you want to just explain your understanding of schedule versus modelling? We kind of ignore calculation in the middle. We think that's a bit of a waste of everyone's time. So maybe it's just distinguishing that for our listeners who might not be familiar with that.
You'd probably give a better technical explanation, but at a pretty high level, my understanding is, talking to a range of interested players, including builders who are tasked with making these things work in terms of compliance with the building code, and also other factors that might go to quality or consumer choice that go beyond the building code, is that with a modelling type approach, you get to an overall outcome in terms of an R value, which is to say energy efficiency and other methods of, well, I suppose that's the key method of understanding the extent to which a home or other built environment is efficient, versus a schedule method, which is more prescriptive in terms of your concrete slabs, your triple glazing, for example, and insulation requirements that are more cut and dried. There's my understanding of the basic distinction, but I haven't fully got my head around what it means to do modelling, whereby there are different methods, techniques, huge discrepancy in terms of what I'm hearing about the cost and the complexity, and therefore the time associated with these methods. And if you can shed some light now or recommend where I can get a definitive answer, then I'd be very grateful, because until we resolve that, it's going to be hard to know exactly what the policy response should be. And by the way, can I just add, at time of recording, I don't know what the policy response is. I haven't made any recommendations to fellow ministers about what the approach should be. But as a starting point, and I think this may be a distinction between the schedule versus the modelling method, at least potentially, is that I've got people coming up and saying there's multiples of tens of thousands of extra dollars to build a home in New Zealand. And on the same day that I read commentary where people are, rightly fearful about any change of policy that might imply a lower standard, on the same day we've got news items saying that you've got record levels of homelessness in New Zealand. And no one's cracked that either stripe of government the last, number of years. So we need to take that seriously too.
So our take on that, we've just been reading about the $30,000 to $50,000 extra cost to build to the new requirements. And that's quite fascinating for us, because if you follow the schedule method, and if you are pushed into, as that method pushes us into, R6.6, that's a lot of insulation in the roof. That's not just more insulation. The costs are not just the insulation, it's the framework, literally the framing around that to create the level of space required. So when we jump into the modelling method and we look at what's actually required for a building in its own little climate, if you like, in whatever city, whatever town, whatever space it's going to be built in our view, that's where, and forgive me, it's a lazy way of designing if you follow the schedule method and you design something which is overkill for the climate that it's going to be built in, and it is more expensive for that build and slows down the build time, or there's a whole lot of other aspects to it. So that's our view on why you would use modelling method. So is there a cost in the modelling? Yes. But the overall cost is actually reduced because you're now not doing R6.6 in the roof. You're doing R4, which might fit within an existing typical roof structure. It's those sorts of approaches. So we could talk all day about how and what the low-hanging fruit is around window performance, all those sorts of things. But I wonder if we go back to the simply part, is that simpler to require and to go into legislation? And I mean, it's already there as a tool for people to use. Is that something that we can, lobby you toward the change? I mean, there's lots of people lobbying you against, and we've got this overheating, the cost of build, all of these things that are going on, but there's also a counter argument to some of those as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I consider myself lobbied. Thank you. That's really helpful contribution in itself. So I'll go back and listen to this, even as others are listening to this now and going, yeah, that guy made a really good point. So you did make a really good point, and I think that's definitely what we need to consider. Frankly, if we can get to an overall place that we need to be of our value required to be X, and we don't need to be prescriptive, then that would be ideal. But then the question I'm then trying to resolve is how do we ensure that we've got a robust way of doing that modelling in a way that itself doesn't blow out time and cost or whatever. So I think we're heading in the right direction. I think we can get there, but that's the detail I've been trying to get to the bottom of. I've asked the MB officials to go away and provide some advice on that, and we're sort of in that process, even as the public conversation has started, because I rashly agreed to respond to an OIA request, probably more openly than I should have. On the other hand, I prefer transparency. I'd rather have the dialogue, including with the likes of your good selves and other industry engagement, where people say, oh yeah, have you thought about this? And people do weigh on either side of the argument, but I think to some extent, we're going to all end up in violent agreement, which is something like we want high standards for various reasons, health and obviously the climate implications of that. We don't want to pay ridiculously for it. We want a nuanced system that takes into account the particular environment, as you said a minute ago. So I'm confident we'll get there.
Okay, so tell me how we do that more cheaply.
I was hoping you would tell me.
Well, I mean, we do. Literally, we have some answers here, and I think this is part of the conversation, which, when we read articles like I've just been, on the time of recording, there's an article which has just come out around the rolling back of the H1 changes. So that was published yesterday. That makes our buildings cheaper, kind of, but it doesn't improve our buildings. So what is that? Let's build more. Even if we build new homes, the people that are living in cars, and I think this is part of that article as well, you're living in a car. You don't go from a car and go out and buy $1 million home. So I think that's pulling two ideas together that don't fit. But how do we build more cheaply? So simply, we've kind of covered. Cheaply, what does it look like?
Well, I think the affordability element comes down to three major components of the system. One is people, one is products, one is processes. So in terms of people, obviously we need well-qualified, skilled people who are available in a market that will hopefully be more conducive to providing opportunities on this side of the Tasman, for example. And so I think we need a pipeline of work. We need the confidence that people will be able to build in a way that's reasonably affordable and that work's available, and we get the economy of scale of a confident and successful construction sector in this country. But I think the real opportunities are both in products, and we're going to try and open up a bit more competitiveness in the market, including to allow some innovative products that probably, by reason of being new and not familiar in the brand names that everyone associates with insulation or plasterboard or whatever. And so if we do that, I think we'll end up with some improvements in terms of affordability as well as product range and therefore supporting consumer choice. But I think with products representing, on some estimations, maybe only 25% of the cost of a build process overall. Skilled labour, of course, is a component we don't want to push down unreasonably in terms of a race to the bottom situation for the workers involved. That leaves processes. It seems to me within the processes, obviously we've got a building control system which focuses around building consents for the purpose of determining compliance with the building code, administered by building consent authorities, BCAs being roughly speaking all the councils plus a consentium in the case of KO. And I think if we can get some of the efficiencies that appear to be possible in that system whereby there are huge delays at the moment, then I think we'll all be a bit better off. Obviously, there are consent fees that are paid, but actually the bigger cost, I think, is associated with delays in those systems. And of course, delays equal cost because, particularly in a high interest rate environment, it's exacerbated. People are paying for the fact that it does take so jolly long to build a house. And, standard residential house, average time, 569 days, I think, in this country just seems to me absurd. And surely we can do better than that. And there are lots of different bits we need to attack, but I think those are the sort of main headlines that we need to get to.
That is a number I have not heard, 569 days. Do you know where that is from?
Yeah, it's some official statistic that I can certainly find for you. I thought it was a typo. I thought, well, that can't be right. I couldn't think if it would be 56.9 days or what it might be, but I'm told it's true. Even if it were, only half that, it sort of seems to me like a lot.
It does. If you think about a small-scale residential, it does seem like a lot.
Shall I try and Google it even as we speak?
I would, that's interesting. That would be a really good one to discover. So while you do that, if we can multitask, the cheaper part that you talked about with product, and we're aware of the changes, at least discussion around changing how products are accepted into the country. Does that differ from what we have already, where people bring in products, go through a compliance pathway, need to meet current or local standards? How does that really differ?
Well, I think actually, theoretically, it doesn't differ because at the moment you can have new products approved. And so on paper, you say, well, we've got a system whereby you can have BCAs, building consent authorities, approve a new product as long as they're satisfied. That's one avenue, and maybe we'll come back to that in a minute if I may. But in terms of CodeMark, we've got a system where we say, well, there's a central repository which government says if they're happy, then you can have your new product certified, and everyone must take note of that from a BCA point of view, and liability would, be carved out to that extent. So on paper, it's a great system. So why would we change that? Well, the answer is, of course, that it's not working in practice, such that it can take up to a couple of years to get the CodeMark approval. Obviously, if you don't get that, then, there's an enormous cost associated with that. You've got the uncertainty. You're not going to strike a deal with a product supplier overseas to import the product, or you're not going to spend the research and development investment that you're going to need in this country measuring against maybe only New Zealand standards and have signed off by CodeMark, and then not automatically be able to meet the overseas standards and prove that, such that you're not export ready, which is an opportunity cost for New Zealand businesses. So actually, it's the process is the punishment. You might get there in the end, but at what cost? And the fact that is all just so jolly hard means that people simply don't do that. That's, how I see that.
How do you change the process? What do you do actually to make it easier? Because you still need to ensure that it's meeting the standards required in New Zealand.
Yeah, well, the answer is that we can save a lot of heartache, time, cost, uncertainty if we say that there are products that can meet overseas standards, where the overseas standards are at least as high as those in New Zealand, and we've got products in credible, comparable jurisdictions that already meet those, then they should be fair game for New Zealand, because we're not going to lower the standard. We're just going to say that the standard, equivalent standard or higher, again, has been met elsewhere. And I've just glibly said credible and comparable jurisdictions, but I think that is reasonably important detail, and that's the work that MB is doing as we speak. So that's to say a jurisdiction that we consider credible, they've got a reputation for building well in that country or state. And comparable means that in respect of the type of product we're talking about, it is reasonable to compare New Zealand conditions with those overseas. So if we're talking about structural elements, then we want standard systems and certification systems and products themselves measured against those and certified against those that are in a country that's also seismic prone in the same way that New Zealand is. Might be California, Japan, Norway might be obvious examples there.
If those products are related to seismic. Yeah.
Well, that's right. But if there are non-structural elements for which that's not relevant, then, we open up the map a bit more. But then you say, well, there might be ones, it might be windows in relation to the intense UV we've got in New Zealand, maybe almost uniquely to that level. And then, coastal conditions, we're not the only country with coastline, but the ones that, have good standards that would meet the wind and spray zones that are associated with housing and other built environment in New Zealand. So we're trying to do that in a nuanced way and not throw out the baby with the bathwater. But nevertheless, there is a whole world out there of opportunity to have some of these products made more available in New Zealand.
So a couple of things there. I'm interested in where you've got your UV data from, because if you look at an international standard, we're about the middle. That's I think a lie that's been fed into our industry for a long, long time that maybe we need to put to bed as well. So there's some things there which hold up. And I think when we're sold this lie that we've got a unique climate, that doesn't help the importation of products. We're special, it rains here. Hang on, we live in the same way that other people do, but our building standards are definitely, or our building outcomes are definitely lower. So there's a bunch of stuff in behind all of that, which would be really interesting. And again, I'm not fact checking you as you try and find your 569 days as we do this during our recording, but this is what's so interesting to me, and where somebody gets in someone's ear and tells them the truth, and then somebody else comes in with a different truth. That's a problem in our industry because of the outcomes of that. And again, for people. So I'm kind of going a big circle on what the actual outcome is that we're trying to achieve here. So we've got product which is available worldwide, some of which is definitely suitable here, but somebody has to judge. So coming back to equivalencies of standards, that's one thing, but somebody still has to judge. So if we're trying to take cost out of the build process, then how do we do that? Is that an MB role? Is that, as it is right now, an engineer's role, looking at equivalencies, looking at performance of product, where it's going to work in New Zealand on a particular building? Whose responsibility is that to speed up this process to reduce cost?
Ultimately, it's government, because if we are saying to building consent authorities, you must accept as approved the following products, to avoid having each of them themselves go through that process. And by the way, that's the other limit. I'd be really keen to come back to that if I may. Then we need to be quite helpful, I think, in the detail we give and say, literally, these jurisdictions, these types of products, these certification systems are all fair game. We don't want to reinvent the wheel where it's not necessary to do so. So, I mean, I think I'm in agreement with the points you're making. Although on UV specifically, it's music to my ears that might not be the case.
It was to me, to be fair. It was to me just a few years ago when one of my colleagues actually did the digging and pointed out that actually this is a bit of a weird lie which is fed to us, that we have this special climate with special UV conditions. It's just not true.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, brilliant if so. I mean, that's if we can sort of be helpful in a way of liberalising, that's great. But I'm also trying to be a little bit cautious about causing angst that we will flood our market with products that are unsuitable for New Zealand conditions.
Great. But what you're promoting or proposing is not flooding the market with unsuitable products. There's checks and balances there to make sure that they do meet standards or equivalent standards. They do have the right performance for the use case. So I'm just thinking about that as a process. We've got product, and we've got performance, we've got limitations of those products. Somebody has to judge that. So that has to be somehow, and I don't know whether it needs to be legislation, but it certainly is already embedded in the regulations around what we accept. So how do we speed up? Again, how do we get to that cheaper product?
Yeah.
Maybe that's the wrong way to look at it. Maybe it's not cheaper product, it's the right product, but we've got right products that are dotted all around the globe, some of which are half the cost to do equivalent job here. So
absolutely,
that will make our buildings cheaper.
Yeah. Well, from a process point of view, at risk of getting too geeky, from a political or parliamentary process point of view, we need an amendment to the Building Act that's being drafted, literally as we speak. I think the latest draft came back to us or went back to the Parliamentary Council Office for drafting as recently as yesterday. We're getting there. We're going to amend the Building Act that says that there's a category of products that shall be deemed acceptable and approved for use in New Zealand, and they'll be defined in regulation or gazette. And that's why it is now, again, work in progress, that MB is consulting with anyone who's got a view on it, frankly. And I've told them to go far and wide to hear the views of people who are engaged in the space and have that knowledge. I'm not going to impose my own views on the matter. I could probably barely spell UV, let alone know whether it's right somewhere in the middle there, let alone the worst in the world. We're compiling a list, and it's going to be certain countries, certain products, certain certification standards. It's going to be really clear. And it's that clarity and that certainty that I think people need. And certainly from the point of view of the BCAs, that the councils that are, in the difficult position of having to sign off on new products as well as specific designs and applications. We've got 67 different legal entities, each with their own nervousness around the joint several liability that might attach to decision making that's novel and therefore dangerous, risky in this space, and they're each doing their own thing, which is the system as it currently stands. So huge inefficiency, and as ratepayers, we should be grateful that our respective councils are making life difficult for people who are trying to do new things, because there's a risk associated with that. See here, leaky buildings, but also climate resilience in terms of flooding, also in terms of earthquake-prone characteristics. Central government always ends up stepping in, as well as local government too, sometimes, to be fair. So I think there's a system we could get to where we don't have 67 different entities all forming a separate view on whether a particular product is suitable in this country or not.
Which happens now, and it's good that people are asking the question. I think that's pretty good. So regarding council, I know that Simon's got a burning question in here regarding Jeff Aronson, who's one of our Auckland senior members of the City Council. So, Simon.
So I'm not sure if you've seen Jeff's video recently that he made for the Boynes conference, which is a bit of a spoof of, a remote inspection. So how do we ensure that the remote inspections are not being utilised by the builder as a way to avoid dodgy work?
I think in the case of the point that he's making, if we've got cowboys out there who are doing a shoddy job, then we need not to tolerate that. And it might well be that we've got a system that says, well, only those who have got a good record in terms of compliance and passing inspections by visual, in-person means will have the right or the ability to have remote visual inspecting. So that's a point that I'm very happy to take on board, and in fact had occurred to me independently, believe it or not. And there are also other nuances that might say, for example, well, you certainly need to prove that we're having the right building inspected, but there are geolocating functions on these things. It's 2024. That said, there are also parts of New Zealand that don't have particularly good internet reception, and where there's that connectivity lack, well, that's something that the government in general is working on for various reasons, not limited to making building inspections a simpler and more straightforward process. The reality is there are caveats that we can put on the system, and we can say that it should be a default method but not used in every single case. And actually, by the way, that's exactly what I agree with as a starting point. And that's why we're consulting on saying what should a system look like in which we have that as a default, but with particular, maybe less reliable building practitioners or places or types of buildings for which it's less appropriate. So let's have that deal. Let's have that conversation. Let's see if we can get to a good system, because it's been quite funny. A few of the media interviews given by building inspectors and others who are active in the space have been really interesting, because they've said something like, we use remote inspections a lot. We definitely think it's the way of the future, but we don't want to use it in every case. And then the headline says something like, skepticism or, concerns voiced about using remote visual inspections. And I thought, well, that's not at all what they're saying. They're saying they should use them, and they're already using them in most cases, but they just need some good guidelines. Well, that's exactly my point. That's all I'm saying too. So, this is not a cue for a rant about, whether media fairly characterises discussions to which politicians unreasonably object. But anyway, you get the idea.
So we've got Chris Penk, we've got Chris Bishop, we've got Christopher Luxon, we've got Chris Hipkins. There are too many Chris's in Parliament. Which ones do we get rid of first?
I think there's probably one too many.
So Chris Hipkins recently accused the government of inaction, or worse, pulling the rug from under the Building for Climate Change with the work in progress. What's your take? What's your understanding of the urgency around climate change?
Climate change is obviously a massive issue across government, but more importantly, New Zealand society and in communities, and it's big now and it's going to be big going forward. So we've got to take that seriously. But if what I'm hearing from our political opponents is that, well, first of all, criticising us for not doing a thing that they didn't get across the line themselves, well, obviously I'm going to be a little bit sniffy about that from a political point of view. But the more important point from the point of view of the New Zealander who just wants an environment in which they can live, work and play that is sound, safe, affordable, but also makes sense from a climate change mitigation and adaptation perspective, is how do we balance those things? How do we actually get to a good result? And that's why we're having these conversations about how best we measure and account for the fact that there's carbon involved in the process. And one of the best things we can do, I think, is actually have more efficient and productive building sector. And if we are going to enable, because we're going to be a bit more imaginative around how consents are provided, or whether even we need them at all, if perhaps there's building taking place according to pre-approved climate-friendly designs, for which then you maybe say you don't need a consent application, maybe just get a licensed building practitioner, another qualified registered practitioners to go ahead and do it. To me, we're getting away again from that false choice of things that are necessarily costing more versus the quality. I think maybe we can have our cake and eat it too, but it does require some imagination. It does require doing things differently from how we've done it under previous national and Labour governments alike.
So that probably really leads into the whole granny flat changes, where you're proposing the people being able to build granny flats without a resource or a building consent. How do you see that working out without us, once again, really ending up with a whole lot of poor quality shacks sort of put together?
I would say, first of all, we're consulting on the detail because we want that to be right. But I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that, first of all, these are relatively low risk. We're talking single level, quite small by definition, up to 60 square metres. And we're talking about having licensed building practitioners, registered plumbers, drains layers, gas fitters, electricians, some of whom can already provide producer statements, and who old mate at the council who's going to wander around with a clipboard doesn't really know much about anyway, isn't necessarily a specialist. So that's kind of the great fiction of the building control system at the moment as it stands. So we're talking about a pretty low risk environment. Will there be the occasional situation where someone signs off work or provides that wouldn't have got through under a standard building consent regime? Maybe. But if so, then we need to identify those who are bad faith actors, maybe who are some combination of unethical or incompetent, and get them struck off and not allow them just to pop up somewhere else, doing the same work again under a different company name. Shadow's Builders 2004 number 2 limited. I mean, we've got to get much better at this. This is an age-old problem. It sort of amuses me and frustrates me in equal measure when people say, "Oh, you can't possibly have a system where there might be a dodgy builder doing a bad job. You need council involved to pick them up." Well, the whole reason we know about some of these cowboys out there is precisely because they've done the work they haven't gotten picked up. So let's not kid ourselves. We're living in some sort of utopia now, but it'll be, I think, a reasonable trade-off. But it's also prompting a whole heap of questions, which again, already trying to answer in a different sphere. But what is the value of occupational licensing? What does it mean to be a licensed building practitioner? Does that mean anything? Because if there's no particular value in requiring or allowing that to be used, and there's no sort of trade-off in terms of saying, well, that means we can trust you to build in accordance with the building code and maybe be audited in terms of that work, maybe a consent free pass is given on the basis that they haven't had any issues, and maybe we recertify more diligently than we currently do, because then there's a point to it. So all these questions are swirling around, and I think we'll get to a sensible place that reflects a risk-based approach. That's where we've got to get to with this.
There's a bunch of stuff we could unpack out of that, and I think part of it is training. So when we talk about the skills or the quality of the outcome of the build and trustworthy builders, I was recently in Germany with basically an educational group looking at the dual vocational educational system there. And one of the people that we were with, I was sitting at dinner with her, and she said, when I employ a tradesperson to work on my house, if they're a German-trained carpenter or German-trained tradesperson, she said, the words she used were, I know what I'm going to get. Now, our method of finding out how good a builder is to ask our neighbour, ask a friend, ask family, does anybody know, is there a local builder that anybody can recommend? Now that, to me, I understand it, but it's tragic. Our system, we've lost skills in our industry. We lost them in the 80s. You don't get those back easily. In fact, we didn't get them back. The skills that we have need a massive rev up. How do we go about this? And I know that's not your ministerial portfolio, I understand that, but it is definitely connected to all of the things that we're talking about. If we don't have the skills to put together a building in a sensible way, if we compare it to a plumber, self-certifying, compare it to an electrician, self-certifying, they understand what they're doing. They should understand what they're doing. They are regulated. There are clear boundaries of what they can do and can't do. But it's a bit of a cowboy's outfit when it comes to building, as you've just pointed out. If you don't know how to do what you're doing and you get in trouble for it, you just close up shop and open again next week. How do we get around that from a training? Is there anything that you are involved with from that training, from the educational space? And is that just another area that we need to go on and keep on lobbying?
I think I always keep on lobbying in all these areas because actually, I mean, if we don't use the L word, but if we say that we want to engage with people who know what the hell they're talking about, which is, again, I'm not just saying this because I'm sat around the table with you. I make the point always when engaging with industry, government needs to know from you what it is that you need, and including in skills and vocational training, how well does the apprenticeship system work? You're right, technically that's not my area. That's Penny Simmons, Tertiary Education Minister, but I keep close to her in terms of, her thinking on that, and I'm really keen that building construction, and I'm confident that building construction will be a key player that's recognised as important, very important in its own right within the architecture and the ecosystem of tertiary education in this country. Obviously, as you quite rightly point out, we're crucially reliant on that. I think one thing it's possible to lose sight of, certainly if one's sitting in the beehive or in a glass tower in Lambton Quay, generally where policymakers reside and want to create perfect systems, that we can lose sight of that big picture, which is the construction sector in this country is really hurting right now. And I mean, I don't want all the best Kiwi builders to be found in Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane. We need them here, right? So, in terms of providing, again, that certainty and reducing some of those delays and enabling people to get on and do work, a certain amount of it is actually at that strategic level of saying, how can we ensure we've actually still got a viable sector for a generation in this country? Because I really fear, not only because we're, losing families overseas and they'll have a good enough time in Australia. I don't know why, but they'll have a good enough time in Australia. They might, settle there permanently. That's a loss to New Zealand Inc. But also then from a building industry point of view, when we're ready to ramp up again, we get those interest rates under control, but in turn by taming inflation. And I think we're getting there. Then we're going to look around and say, great, we're ready to crack on with a whole heap of building work there's a lot of appetite for. And who's available to do it?
That comes into the, who's going to build the granny flats at a level of quality. And I know, Simon, I think you had this written in one of your questions that we talked about yesterday, was just around that. I think you had the most vulnerable people, and I'm not sure that they just by default is in that sort of category, except that building, like the house that you have now, 90-year-old home, I'm assuming uninsulated, single glazed, which would be exactly the same as mine right now. That's something that we end up with if we build poor quality buildings now, in 90 years' time. That is not going to be fit for purpose. I would argue that your home is not fit for purpose now for your family, for health and comfort, in whichever order you want to put that in. And mine is not either. Mine's an 80-year-old house. It's not comfortable. It's not a healthy place to be, but I have plans to renovate. That's a different story. So how do we ensure, and this is a training, this is a materials, this is a control question as well, how do we ensure that we don't build crap?
We have a minimum standard and we require that is met. But what we've been discussing in the last few minutes is whether we have that met in a way that reflects the current system, whereby you have to make an application, provide a design, someone comes out and checks it at regular intervals, maybe isn't available for a couple of weeks here or there, that delays everything, you get it signed off at the end by way of CCC, versus saying, well, if you've got someone who we feel entitled to rely on as being skilled and trustworthy and all those things, to provide, or maybe that person is provided in the start with a pre-approved plan that we know is approved in itself, and including that it's got the right green star or number of whatever that certification is that we want to go to in the sustainability place. Say, go ahead, do that, provide us the documents and the proof later, and maybe at that point you get a CCC. So maybe you don't need a consent in the first place, but you get the sign off at the end. But in the meantime, you're not delaying the whole jolly thing, and you get to that reasonable, well, better than reasonable standard. So again, all things are possible, and we're in the exciting phase at the moment of trying to work out exactly where we should land on it. But also it'll be an iterative process. And the granny flat, the project of saying, well, maybe there's a system that says if we can trust people to do a relatively low risk thing, and if that works well, then maybe that's a concept we could be more bold on elsewhere.
All right, final question from me. Your 90-year-old house, what are you going to do?
Well, to be fair, we have done a few things over the years that have added layers of glazing and insulation. I mean, I went under the house myself at one point, actually, with some, I won't say a brand name, but whatever the standard insulation method was. It's a miracle I'm not still there now, actually, because it got quite tight at the upper reaches on the slope that we're on. So we've done things. We've sort of taken opportunities we've been able to do along the way to improve things. But if you've got windows that don't quite shut properly, then inevitably you're spending more energy to keep at a reasonable level so that my family and hopefully your family too, in your nearly as old house, aren't suffering respiratory conditions and so on. And this is part of what we need to get better for everyone's houses. And I honestly think that there's a disproportionate focus on having standards for new builds that don't reflect the reality that most of our stock in this country is very old, very poor quality. And if we spend half the energy and effort and money somehow retrofitting those in a way that gets them up from a really low standard to even a reasonable standard, would make infinitely more gain than by having ever more gold-plated levels of insulation and other standards in relation to new builds.
And that's our thing really, isn't it, with new build? If we're building 20,000 new homes a year, that is not replacing old stock fast enough at all. But that then is the answer. It's not replacing, it's reuse of existing, retrofitting. But then again, standards, controls and product, was the insulation that you put under your floor perfectly fitted according to NZS 4.2, whatever that's...
I can tell you it wouldn't have been because I did it.
Yeah. And look, DIY is the curse of our industry in a way, in a weird way. And I was working at Mitre 10 when the ads came out with those boys in the playground saying, hey, give me a hand on, we're building a retaining wall. That to me, that's the curse of our industry because of the level of skill and then the outcome. And then you need a building inspector to go in and see that, no shoddy work has been done in the building you're about to buy. So this whole, I'm not talking about, not being able to paint your fence, but there's an outcome there, which means that people are encouraged to do work which they're not qualified or skilled to do. And I don't know what the answer is there.
That's a really interesting point. I'll think about that a lot in the next few days. That's a really interesting point.
I'm not asking the government to step in and say no more DIY.
Let's not make that the headline, please. But no, you're right. I mean, it is a real goal, and at the risk of putting words in your mouth, but just responding to the point you make. Yeah, I mean, if we've got the likes of me who know the right end of the hammer to hold, but not much more, if the unintended consequence of having a system that is so tightly controlled in terms of skills and qualification and building consents that it's easier, frankly, just and only realistic and feasible to do it yourself, maybe there's an unintended consequence in terms of the end product, frankly. And that's the case. I mean, not to personalise it to my house too much, but we've started down that path. There's bits where I've sort of done a bit here or a bit there because if I got a guy in to do it, guy or girl, by the way, obviously, non-gender specific, that it cost a fortune, didn't need to be so much, because last thing we want is for them to be sort of jumping through a whole heap of hoops because they're not quite sure if it needs a building consent, but they better get it anyway, and then you're down a hell of a path.
Yeah, challenge.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Chris. It's been great having you on the show this morning, and perhaps we can get you on back in a year or so and we can follow up on some of these initiatives and see where they're heading.
That's really interesting. And I think I'd love to do that, by the way. I'll take you up on that, on that offer, live on air, so to speak. But I've really enjoyed the chat today, and I'd love to be marked on the homework that I've set myself in terms of being quicker, more affordable, and simpler as well. But certainly, you guys are obviously doing great things here, and I'm really excited to see the work that you and others who are really forward-thinking in the space can help get along the way. And if the government can enable that and support that and incentivise that, then we're up for that. So thanks again for the chat, and look forward to doing it again with you sometime.
Sharing knowledge is at the heart of our strategy to make buildings better for everyone. Sign up for our podcasts to learn more about creating healthy living conditions by protecting building structures from external and internal moisture damage. Thanks for listening. Looking forward to having you with us next time.